political system in America is experiencing great turmoil. Mounting frustrations on both sides continue as political parties continue to be more and more charged each and every election. I believe the abolishment of the Electoral College could help to relinquish some of the stresses that we're currently experiencing in this political climate here in the United States. I chose this topic because I believe it's important not only to me, but to everybody actually in this room. We're all American voters, we all live in the United States of America, and for that reason, the structure of our voices should be heard on an equal playing field, not disheveled differently because of where we live in these United States, caused by arbitrary lines. Your vote shouldn't matter more than mine shouldn't matter more than yours, and it should be the same way from California to Maine. I've researched multiple topics to share with you today on why the elimination of the Electoral College is so important. These include the unfair weight distribution from the American voters, the swing state and safe state mentality, and also the forcing of a two-party system that even George Washington believed was going to be flawed and possibly a small downfall of the United States itself. First, I would like to begin with explaining the unfair weight distribution of the American voter. Last I stated, and last I believe, every vote counts equally, as I previously mentioned. Just like I said, yours counts as much as mine, I should count as much as yours, no more, no less. Unfortunately, that's not the case in America. According to US Election Atlas .org, the 7 least populous states right here in America account for 3.1 million voters, 3.1 million American people, according to the 2008 Census Bureau. They have 21 electoral voters, the same amount as Florida does, but they have over 9.5 million Americans that live in their state. That means 3.1 million Americans count for the same amount as over 9.5. This is North Dakota, South Dakota, DC, Delaware, Alaska, Vermont, and Wyoming. And when all 3.1 million of them speak up, they have the same amount of voice and the same amount of voter strength, according to the Electoral College, as over 9.5 million Floridian voters. This should be about equal representation if it's structured by the Electoral College. Not differently, not more, not less. They should be on an equal playing field. It further continues with the math not adding up according to the Huffington Post. Wyoming has 3 electoral votes for 530,000 citizens in Wyoming. That's 175,000 per electorate vote. Meanwhile, Texas has over 25 million Americans, and they have 32 electoral votes. So that means Wyoming has 175,000 voters, 175,000 Americans for each electorate vote they have. Meanwhile, Texas, they're represented by over 700,000 equal to one electorate. These have the same amount of strength in the Electoral College. So when Texan voters go up to the polls, they have 1/4 of the voice that Wyomingite voters have because of the balance and structure, the unfair balance and the unfair structure of the Electoral College. Why should 50 separate states decide the presidency? We're all united, and these arbitrary lines that are crossed shouldn't pick and choose which state that you get to decide in the Electoral College or who the president is. You should be able to vote equally and fairly, and this diminishes the value when some states receive more, less. Switching now is going to be the safe state and swing state mentality. As you know, presidents often are talked about on election night, On election night, it doesn't matter which broadcast you turn into, whichever political leanings they are, whichever broadcast, it doesn't matter which one, they still talk about the same states. That's Florida, Pennsylvania, Virginia, North Carolina. Ohio is very important. Colorado, our beautiful home state, is also important. And unfortunately, it's because of the swing state versus safe state mentality, something that the Electoral College was hoping to diminish based on population. It's now based on an unfair 50% is a winner-take-all kind of structure. According to World Population Review, the biggest worry, is if we were to disband the Electoral College, what would happen is the presidential candidates, red, blue, it doesn't matter which candidates, they would only go to California, they go to Florida, Texas, Pennsylvania, and the most populous states. Why not? They want the most voters, they would only go to these ones. Why wouldn't they? Unfortunately, the math doesn't add up there because those 5 most populous states with California and New York and Florida, they only account for 37% of the American population, according to worldpopulationreview.com. Those states don't amount to winning the presidency just by getting all of their voters. It would take 100% of them all voting for the same candidate for them to still not reach 50% of the total American vote if everybody voted. And if they did vote for 100% for one single candidate, it's probably likely that more states are voting because it is a candidate that is formidable to the job. They meet the requirements of the United States and of the people, and that's why they're being voted. But they're not all going to vote 100% in favor. California, New York, Florida, they're not 100% going to reside behind one candidate. So this structure only perpetuates a flawed system that isn't representing the American people. I talk about Wyoming quite often on here. I've mentioned it on the first 2 graphs, and that's because it is actually ranked 51 out of 50 in population. Out of 50 states, they're ranked 51, and that's because Washington, D.C., though it is not a state, still has a higher population than Wyoming. So Wyoming should receive the most benefits, the biggest benefactor of the Electoral College. They should be receiving visits from these general election candidates. They should be talked about, they should be brought about, because their electoral votes, you believe, matter. Unfortunately, it doesn't for 2 reasons. 1, because they're considered a safe state. 2/3 are Republicans, and for that matter, anything above 50% of the vote in that state is a winner-take-all. They get all 3 electoral votes, which I will come back to, but also they're not receiving the attention you'd believe they deserve. According to the Wyoming newspaper, the Casper Star-Tribune, in a report of the 16 candidates for the 2016 general election and all of their visits, only 3 of them ever stepped foot into the state the entire election. So, if it's not helping the lowest on the totem pole, the one that needs the most help, what is it here for, other than to unfairly balance the scale in far too long of a system? Because even with all the strength of the votes that they have, as you can see from the last 2 graphs, they still aren't receiving the benefits they deserve on the national scale. Furthermore, in the National Popular Review Vote.com, it indicated of 399 presidential visits in the general election, 273 of them were in just 6 states. Wyoming didn't receive any attention, neither did Oklahoma, neither did North, South Dakota, Montana. Most of the smaller states still didn't receive representation. Only these swing states did. California, in its largest population in America, received only 1 visit. Meanwhile, Pennsylvania received 55, North Carolina 54 for Pennsylvania, 55 for North Carolina, and 71 whopping visits for Florida, because in the Electoral College, it isn't about getting more voters, it's about just getting above 50% of a state's vote, which is an unfair system. Now, going to the transition of talking not only about the swing state, safe state mentality, but the perpetuation of a 2-party system is something that was warned about by none other than the only unanimously elected 2-term president and founding father of America, George Washington. He said in his farewell address in 1796 that the 2-party system was something he was terrified of. He didn't want us to combat each other because he mentioned that it would sharpen the spirit of revenge and party dissension. He called it a frightful despotism. Yet here we are, 2019, still experiencing this battle of red versus blue, of conservative and liberal, progressive, reds and blue candidates. The system is only further perpetuated by the Electoral College. They don't receive representation. As I've mentioned, you just need 50% of that state's vote. And you can see here a better graph to further represent it. So, say this is Colorado. Colorado has 9 electoral votes, and 40% of that state's vote went red, went Republican. Meanwhile, 35% went to the Democrat. And a huge 25%, though it doesn't sound like a lot, 25% of the state didn't pick red, didn't pick blue, they picked for a third party. That 25% receives 0 electoral votes. Not a 1. The general election, when they're on the broadcast, they don't talk about it. They talk about who won the state. And in this instance, the Republican candidate would receive all 9 of those votes. It's not separated equally. So why aren't their voices heard? Why in a system when I vote, you vote, we all vote, that I don't get represented at all because I band away from the red or blue and I pick a different candidate because I believe in their views, I believe in what they talk about, and I believe they're the right candidate, yet they receive no attention. Once more, these demonstrations in the source material all exclaim the Electoral College should be banished. The purpose of the Electoral College no longer lifts Americans up on the same scale for one voice, one vote. It has become disheveled, and the weights of these votes have become unfair. It propagates an unnecessary swing state versus safe state mentality, and it doesn't hold water when you need to show what the American people decide and what they would vote on. America is a democracy. Since its inception, these United States were a government for the people, of the people, by the people. Americans should decide who they are casting their votes for, and they should be represented by those votes. Thank you. Please clap.